Hi there, I'm Darren McDermott and you're watching Dukascopy TV. Argentina has slipped back into recession. I'm joined today by Aryam Vázquez from Oxford Economics. So Aryam, high inflation and weak exports to Brazil are the key factors for this fall. So what are your views on a tighter monetary policy and how do you think they should be tackling these problems?
Well, the tighter monetary policy was to be expected, and it's a remnant of some of the policy adjustments that were implemented last year, primarily to stem the volatility in the exchange rate market, particularly on the peso, and to tighten up conditions in view of emigrating capital flows, which we saw earlier last year as a result of all the conundrum that was taking place in the global emerging markets, and of course in Argentina with the uncertainty regarding the outlook for the country. In recent weeks or months, I should say, there has been some moderation of that tight monetary policy in the sense that the central bank has moved to lower rates. They have also eased caps on lending and so forth. So that really has not sat too well with the markets because it raises concerns about a possible shift in monetary policy dynamics, and all this at a time when you still have a country with very, very high inflation. So it was quite precarious of them to take such measures at that time. I think they had made much headway in trying to strengthen market sentiment and investor confidence with this tightening monetary policy, namely in order to tackle inflation, to really stabilize the peso market, the interest rate market. But now there seems to be some shifting of priorities, and we're in a wait and see as to how Argentina is going to proceed. The ideal scenario is one in which we know they're in a recession, but they really need to take this medicine, if you will, this medicine of tightening monetary policy, addressing inflation, and really implementing a number of structural reforms that have been unaddressed if they're really going to get some growth and some positive development in the long run.
Argentine bonds rallied this week, pushing yields to a 3-year low. But Aryam, tell us some more.
Sure. I think the movement in the bond market is 100% related to the events concerning the country's ongoing debt saga and how they're going to address the holdout creditor issue. So a couple of weeks ago, actually last week, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Argentina in the pari passu bond issues, and that led to a massive widening in spreads, primarily with the markets interpreting the move as a potential default. Argentina came out with guns blazing and speaking harshly that they would default, that they would not make payment on the debt, that they weren't willing to cooperate, and that led to further widening. However, they have since recanted. There's certainly a more conciliatory tone coming out of Buenos Aires, and even Mrs. Kirchner has come out saying that they're willing to negotiate. So right now there is a negotiation with the holdout creditors, and that's why we're seeing spreads compress back. That being said, I think there's a great deal of volatility in Argentina right now, primarily in the bond market. I certainly would not be a buyer of Argentine bonds, despite the high yield and the carry that we see, because there's a great deal of uncertainty as to how these negotiations are going to proceed, and more importantly, Argentina has a very limited room for maneuverability in these negotiations, and to boot, they really don't have the resources to make payments. So there's going to be some kind of negotiation needs to be put forward, and one that the holdout creditors are willing to tolerate. So it's going to be a bumpy ride ahead, I think.
And what sort of trading trends are we seeing with the Argentine peso, and what is your forecast?
With regard to the peso, the Argentines want to keep the peso generally weaker, more competitive, but without these volatile and wild gyrations. So as long as the peso maintains this underlying weakening trend, or competitive, as they would call it, I think that bodes well for Argentine, primarily because this is still an export-oriented economy, and at the end of the day, they want to boost exports as much as possible. So what the Argentines are trying to do is prevent these wild fluctuations. And, for example, when we had the debt saga situation flare up last week, the peso was a little bit jittery. When we had all these pushbacks and uncertain developments with regards to how and what type of commitment we're going to see from Argentina in terms of policy measures going forward, there was some volatility in the peso market. So ultimately, that's their goal. There is room for another devaluation later in the year. At this time, I sense it's probably lower. The risk of that is lower than it was several months ago because the economy seems to be correcting and adjusting a bit slowly. So there may not be the impetus to engineer another devaluation later this year. But again, this is Argentina. Anything goes. We don't know how deep this recession can get. I sense, we're now targeting a negative 1.5% GDP growth rate for this year, but it could come a little bit lower because they have had a good harvest. The outflow of capital has not been as severe as many expected, and the external dynamic is a little bit rosier, maybe not for Brazil, but for the world in general. So it remains to be seen. Our current forecasts are not calling for another devaluation this year, but anything is possible in Argentina.
Aryam, thank you very much for your time today. Well, viewers, do stay tuned and do not go anywhere as we have plenty more just like this heading your way. See you very soon.